Hi, my name is Elly Jones. I am an MPA student at ECU, and I'm also an employee of the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. I've worked there 7 years. Currently, I'm a probation officer, but I do have experience working with inmates, and specifically the inmates that I'm talking about in this presentation on solitary confinement. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what's the problem. And I can't really talk about the problem without explaining kind of what solitary confinement is. Solitary confinement is a means of disciplinary action or a means of protection if an inmate fears for their life or safety, in which they are locked down for 23 hours a day in a very small space with little human interaction, even less positive human interaction, and little to no stimulation. Custody reviews are only conducted every 6 to 12 months. And what a custody review is a review in which they determine whether or not that individual is allowed to be released back to general population or they're going to stay in solitary confinement longer. Inmates are affected mentally by solitary confinement, and sometimes these inmates are released directly from solitary confinement back into the free world, back to the general public. When that release date comes up, you can't keep them in prison anymore. And even if they have been behind a closed door 23 hours a day for years, they are released back into the public, and sometimes that's very dangerous. Mental and physical health issues amassed in solitary confinement may be preventable, probably are preventable, and treating things like hypertension, paranoia, violent behavior, cardiovascular disease, all of those things are costly. They cost the state money, they cost taxpayers money, whether it be a federal prison, a state prison, or a privately owned prison. It's costly to have to treat these inmates, and they have an obligation to treat the inmates. They can't just let them have these things. Lastly, solitary confinement has not ever really been statistically proven to deter bad behavior. If they're in there and they get released, oftentimes they come right back. Sometimes they've been in there so long that they're not comfortable in general population, and they will intentionally act out to get put back into solitary confinement. Goals and objectives. So the goals and objectives that I have are to lower the rate of mental and physical ailments within solitary confinement, increase human interaction and healthy stimulation while in solitary confinement, decrease the number of inmates going to and repeatedly coming back from solitary confinement, and then implement more frequent custody reviews and less time between custody reviews for whether or not an inmate's ready for release. Sorry, not too far. Stakeholders. There's several stakeholders when we're talking about inmates that are in solitary confinement. The first, of course, is the inmate population, because they are the ones either in solitary confinement right now, they have been to solitary confinement, or they are at risk of going to solitary confinement. And all inmates are at risk of going while they are incarcerated. The second stakeholder is inmate family and friends. We are holding people's dads, moms, children, uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, friends in prison. And even though they're there for a specific purpose, they oftentimes have family members that love them very much and have a very strong interest that they are, protected while they are incarcerated. So if that inmate who has loved ones on the outside is in solitary confinement, those friends and family are interested in how they're being treated and how they are doing physically and mentally. Prison employees are a direct stakeholder because they work with these inmates every day. They are at risk of attack every day, and the things that they do for these inmates are time consuming. There's already a very low number of people working in the prisons. They're understaffed. Any sort of extra work put on them, any sort of policy changes that would require them to do more could be problematic if measures weren't taken to make that not an issue. So, and also changes that we make might prevent staff assaults. So that would be another reason they would be interested in what we're doing. Prison organizations are of course interested, because whether this flops or goes very well is a reflection directly on them. And lastly, the general public is a direct stakeholder, because we're releasing these inmates back into society. The whole point of the Department of Corrections is to correct bad behavior, to reform, and to reduce recidivism. So if we're letting these inmates out and they're acting crazy and hurting the general public, that's not good. And the general public is interested in having these people released and acting better upon release. There are also some indirect stakeholders, and those would be the federal and state government, mental health professionals, and medical researchers, and the media. Federal and state government kind of for the same reasons that the whole prison organization is interested in that. If that prison is in their area or in their jurisdiction, if it does well or it flops with changes in policy, they can either brag about good things happening or say, well, I didn't authorize that, or kind of stick their head in the sand if it doesn't go well. Medical professionals, mental health professionals, researchers, they're going to be interested in whether or not the policies that we change in an attempt to help these inmates in solitary confinement work. If we change things and mental health improves, physical health improves, they're going to want to know why. They're going to want to know what changes we made. It's going to be of interest to them to make further changes for several things, not just prison inmates. And vice versa, if it goes really badly, that's of interest to them too. Lastly, the media. Anything that happens within a prison is kind of a public interest piece. Prisons are interesting. People are kind of enthralled with them sometimes, and the public themselves are a direct stakeholder. The media would be the ones reporting on whether or not these things are going well, and letting the general public know how these things are going in, so they would be a stakeholder as well. Criteria. The criteria I chose were fixed costs, staff availability, variable costs, maintenance, acceptability, and usability. So fixed costs, I put for fixed cost any sort of costs to build any new structures we might need for the changes that we would be making. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what structures might be needed a little bit later in the presentation, but the objective measure for that would of course be money, dollars. Staff availability. I've already talked about how the prisons are really understaffed, so the manpower and time needed to complete any additional tasks would be something that we needed to measure. We would need to know the number of current staff and the number of staff that it would take to safely do implement any of the changes that we are trying to make. Variable costs would be any additional pay to employees and any additional hiring of employees. So if we chose to give employees a raise, or what it would cost to pay more employees to do the things that we need to do. Maintenance, any sort of structural maintenance, and any sort of regular training for staff. Some of the things that I think should be implemented would require training, hopefully annually, if not more than that. And then, of course, anything that we build would need, regular maintenance on some level. Hopefully not all the time, maybe even not for a few years, but eventually something would need to be fixed. Acceptability. Prison organizations are going to have to decide if this idea is feasible. One way to measure the feasibility of what I'm suggesting is to do a security operational assessment. There is a federal organization of prisons that comes and does these assessments. They go and they look around prisons and determine whether or not they're being ran efficiently and whether changes need to be made, and that would be a good way to measure whether or not something like this would be feasible. Lastly, usability, level of difficulty in complying with any new policies that we came up with. I just ranked that from very inconvenient to very convenient as far as how we would measure that. Alternative policies. So here's what I came up with. Some of these are already implemented in some ways, but their changes could be made to them to make them a little bit easier to work with. So my alternative policies are graduated disciplinary actions, rewards for good behavior, a step a step-down program for inmates in solitary confinement, monthly reviews to determine whether or not an inmate is eligible for a step-down or for release from solitary confinement, and programs that safely include segregated inmates in mental health treatment and group therapy. Graduated disciplinary actions are basically, if an inmate steals a banana from the dining hall, they do not need to go to solitary confinement. They need something way less than that to address that particular infraction. They do that already, but because there's different staff every day, different rotations, and different shifts, things are handled differently depending on, you know, who is there that day. There's not, prisons are run 24 hours a day so that you don't always have the same people addressing the same issues. And so sometimes these issues aren't dealt with the same way. So making sure that that graduated disciplinary system was very fair, firm, and consistent, and making sure that there is a proper response to whatever the violation is, and it's not just throw this person in the hole because they looked at me the wrong way. Rewards for good behavior, they do work. They have been effective. A lot of times prisons will allow inmates to order out pizza if they are a certain number of days infraction free, a certain number of months infraction free. The issue with that is that most of the time inmates have to order that pizza using their own money, or whatever it is that they're ordering out, whatever treat they're getting. So if an inmate has remained infraction free, they don't have any money on their books, they start to feel some type of way about that. They get kind of angry. It causes fights. It causes low morale sometimes. And so we would need to do rewards for good behavior that would apply to everyone and would not require any sort of monetary or any sort of spending from the inmate's perspective. Step-down programs. If an inmate's in solitary confinement, and they have remained infraction-free, and we're doing monthly reviews, we can say, okay, this person's caused us no problems. If it's not time to let them out yet, we can at least give them 3 hours out a day instead of 1 hour out a day. We can give them 5 hours out a day instead of 3 hours out a day. We can let them participate in this group activity because they have proven themselves to not be a threat or as much of a threat as the inmate that is constantly attacking people every time someone goes up to his cell or her cell. Monthly reviews instead of the 6 month to a year reviews. So yeah, I think there should be monthly reviews. Making someone stay in a cell for 23 hours a day for 6 months, let alone a year, could make them go completely insane. Makes lots of people go completely insane. It makes them violent. It makes them irrational. It hurts their health. And so these things should be done more often than that. And then lastly, programs that safely include segregated inmates in mental health and group therapy. This is kind of where the structures come into play. Oftentimes prisons have areas in which there are lots of separate, I mean, there's really no other way to say this, cages, recreation cages in which many inmates can be there at one time and can interact with each other without being able to touch one another, without being able to touch a staff member. So, you know, some prisons already have that. Some prisons might need to build something like that, but that would be an excellent place to conduct things like group therapy, mental health sessions, Nar-Anon, Al-Anon, anger management, things that would be pro-social for them, that would allow them to talk to one another in a way that they're not just screaming and yelling at each other all the time. It would be, you know, supervised by a staff member, like a mental health professional, and I think that it could be really helpful. Oops. Yeah, that's it for that slide. Okay, so my actual recommendation